Hey there, and welcome to GDPR Stand Up. I'm Rocio Baeza, the creator of the channel, and I'd like to welcome you to the community where we're going to be talking about all things GDPR related. We want to provide you with simple to understand information on what GDPR is, what it requires, and what steps your company needs to take in order to comply. Now, we're not about presenting long PowerPoint presentations. We don't think that's a good use of your time. We believe in providing you bite-sized chunks of information, much like we would do in a stand-up. And the idea is to give you the information that you need so that you can become GDPR compliant and move on to the other business priorities that you have to get to. All right, so we're going to keep it short to the point. Let's get started. All right, so for today's topic, we're going to be talking about what is GDPR. And I'm just going to move my camera here so that you can actually see the slides. All right, so in a nutshell, what is GDPR? Okay, some quick facts. GDPR stands for General Data Protection Regulation. It goes into effect May of 2018, and it impacts or it's data protection laws that impacts those organizations or businesses that process EU citizen data. In a nutshell, this is what it is. Now, I do have a caveat. So, processing data has a very specific definition, but for the purposes of the overview, let's just assume that we refer to holding of EU citizen information. All right. So, if your company is one that holds any type of information belonging to a EU citizen, it makes sense to continue to watch us. All right. And I think it's important to do a quick applicability test. So this is a test. This is a series of questions that should help you understand whether or not, okay, does GDPR really apply to my company, or can I shut this down and move to something else? And these are the questions that you should ask. Is your business located in the EU? Yes or no? Do you service the EU market? For example, you might be a virtual company, or you might be a US based company that also operates in the EU. Do you also tap into the market there? Yes or no? And finally, do you hold any information about a living person that is from the EU? Yes or no? And you can break this down into two buckets. So, one, think of this in terms of your customers or prospects, people that can become a customer. Do you hold information about customers or prospects that live in the EU? Yes or no? And let's also consider this for either any employees or contractors that you work with. Do you hold information about a living person, a living employee, or contractor that is from the EU or is in the EU? Yes or no? If you answered yes to these questions, one or all, it makes sense for you to continue to do due diligence. It likely means that GDPR does apply to your company at some capacity. All right. So let me move this down here. All right. So let's dig a little deeper. Okay. So GDPR affects entities that hold specific types of information of EU citizens. So at a high level, think of it as any piece of information that either by itself or combined can actually identify one specific individual. And we actually have some examples. So there are actually two categories of data. We're going to try to keep it simple, but the actual categories that come into play for GDPR would be personal data or special categories of personal data. So let's go through some examples. So things like a person's name, ID number, email, address, location information, especially for those companies that might be capturing some type of geolocation information, online identifiers such as an IP address. So these are all examples of pieces of information that either by themselves or in combination with each other or other pieces of information, we can actually pinpoint a specific individual. If your organization is capturing any of these data points from either prospects, customers, or employees, or even a contractor, GDPR very likely applies to you if these individuals live or are from the EU. And when I say EU, I'm referring to the European Union. We also have another set of data types. So these are considered special categories of personal data, and examples of pieces of items that would fall into the category would be anything that reveals either your racial or your ethnic origin, any type of political opinions, religious beliefs, philosophical beliefs, health data, any type of membership to a trade union, your sex life or sexual orientation, and even criminal convictions and offenses. So, going back to our applicability test, if you answer yes to any of these questions, either located in the EU, are serving the EU, or are holding information, any of these pieces of information from individuals that are from or live in the EU, then GDPR probably applies to you and it makes sense to do a deeper dive. All right, so now let's talk about the different areas that GDPR impacts. There is a ton of information out there. You can read the full regulation. There's plenty of other service providers that have summaries available, walkthroughs available. But what I'm trying to do here is break it down in simple terms so that it's actually understandable by a person that does not have years of cybersecurity experience or data privacy experience. At a very high level, GDPR will impact how you run the business. And it's important to remember a business, it runs on three things: people, technology, and processes. And a correct implementation for GDPR compliance will actually impact each of these three areas, not just one, all three. Now, let me walk you through some red flags that I've seen out there. Okay. So you should know there's no single tool, environment, training, like one single action that you can take that will satisfy all your GDPR requirements. This is not true. I've seen claims where folks are saying you can meet GDPR compliance with our environment, or you can meet GDPR compliance with our tool if you move to our environment or start using our tool. Or even if you download a set of templates, you can become GDPR compliant. And you should know that this information it might be misleading. There's no one single action that you can take that will satisfy all GDPR requirements. Make sure that when you're working with vendors or you're listening to any type of sales pitch, that your ears perk up when they say that there's a one-time action that you can take that will satisfy all of your GDPR requirements. This is not true. All right, so going back, so GDPR will impact these three areas of the business: people, technology, and the processes that support the business. All right, so let's break this down. So when we say people, we're talking about the actual responsibilities, the day-to-day activities that your team performs. So this right here is a what I call the 10 GDPR components. So GDPR is this massive regulation. And for someone that hasn't worked in the cybersecurity or the data privacy space, this might feel overwhelming. I've broken it down into 10 components so that this can be more digestible. So when it comes to people, so this means that Specifically, any type of internal record keeping requirements will have to be taken on by your team. So this means that either someone else will have to absorb that responsibility, or you'll have to bring on someone to perform that. It will also require people to operationalize an information security program. And it will also take people to demonstrate compliance. So, demonstrating compliance is actually one of the most significant areas that the GDPR introduces. It basically means that you need to have a record and a set of activities that backs up that you are actually compliant with the GDPR. And this is not something that a single tool or a single piece of technology will be able to capture for you. It will require a person, at least one person, to uh, design that, define that, and capture that, and make sure that it has the appropriate details that are needed to satisfy the requirement. All right, let's move on now to technology. So, when we say technology, we mean that GDPR will impact the use and setup of any tools or technology that you use to run the business. So, think applications, think services, and uh, relating this back to the 10 GDPR components, the most relevant ones would be things like consent mechanisms. So, if consent mechanisms apply to your company, this means that in a situation where you have to get consent from a user, whether it be a lead or a customer, you need a way to present the consent options that they have and capture those, and that will usually be captured in some type of front end, whether it be some type of application process or registration process. And the other component would be what I call data management support. So depending on the organization, you might have to take on specific activities related to providing your user base with specific rights and specific capabilities. And given that your business probably relies heavily on technology, it probably means that we will have to create some type of mechanism that presents those and manages those. And I should preface this by saying so this is just a very high level overview. We're going to be drilling down into specifics for each of these components on future videos. But at a very high level, this is key information that would make sense for you to understand. And lastly, let's talk about processes. So every business needs multiple processes, right? And we usually rely on people to execute those, and we also may rely on technology to help with that. So GDPR will impact this area in that it will either change how you do things today, or it will require that you add new processes so that you're able to satisfy the requirements. And this applies both internally and externally. So internally, that means interactions within the team. Externally, it can be interactions either with your user base, your customers, or any third party partners that you work with. All right. And as it relates to processes, so the impacted areas are the internal records that you have to collect. So this will require a process. You may or may not be doing this today. If you're working with third party partners, you will need a process to make sure that you're vetting the third parties appropriately and you have the appropriate requirements in place. We also talked about consent mechanisms. So if this applies to your company, you will need a process. You may be able to facilitate this through your online app, but you will need a process to manage the consents that you need to collect. We also talked about data management support. We talked about operationalizing an information security program. So it will require putting together processes to develop that, to implement that, and to maintain that. When it comes to breach notifications, this is also a heavy area where it will require either implementing a new process or enhancing current processes in place to make sure that any notifications that you have to provide to either a supervising authority or a, a customer or a prospect, that you're doing that correctly, appropriately. And lastly, demonstrating compliance. So in order for you to show to capture evidence that you are aligned to GDPR, it will require putting together processes in place to achieve that. So, before we move on, I just want to highlight that depending on how your organization is run, and or I should say, given that all organizations, all companies are different, uh, these components may apply to you, but they may apply differently. So just know that there is not one single bullet, not one strict way of meeting GDPR compliance. It will require customizing this based on the service that you provide, the data that you capture, and how your business is set up. All right. So to recap, so GDPR impacts those companies that are handling personal data of EU citizens. So think anybody that's either living there right now or is from the EU. If you answered yes to any of our questions in our quick applicability test, I would recommend that you please continue to do your due diligence. It probably means that GDPR does have some type of impact in your company. And you should also understand GDPR impacts the three components that run the business. So think people, technology, and processes. And you should know that there's not one silver bullet, not one tool, not one environment, not one set of training that will accomplish this. We did break down the GDPR into 10 components, and know that this will vary from organization to organization. This wraps up our session. Thank you very much for checking us out. We understand that you're a busy person. You want to be able to cut to the chase, understand what GDPR requirements apply to your company, and focus only on that. If the video was helpful, please either give us a thumbs up or subscribe so that we can make this information available to more folks. Thanks very much, and we'll see you on the next one. Goodbye.